The Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has urged nations across the Asia-Pacific region to do what they can to avoid a future conflict between the United States and China. In a major speech overnight at the Shangri-La Dialogue, a defence and security forum being held in Singapore this weekend, the PM said there was a collective responsibility to maintain peace and stability. Tensions have been ramping up between China and the US in the Pacific, and in his keynote speech, Mr Albanese said keeping open channels of dialogue is necessary to avoid any potential disaster.
Australia strongly supports the renewed efforts from President Biden's administration to establish reliable and open channels of communication between the governments of the United States of America and the People's Republic of China. I want to recognise the very important speech that Prime Minister Li gave in China recently on this subject, where he said this: "Big powers have a heavy responsibility to maintain stable and workable relations with one another, because the alternative, the silence of the diplomatic deep freeze, only breeds suspicion."
Ewan Graham, who's a senior fellow based in Singapore supporting the Shangri-La Dialogue, says the Prime Minister's speech used targeted language to ensure competition doesn't escalate to conflict.
I think the message that the Prime Minister delivered was calculated to be receptive to a broad common denominator in this region. And it's his first significant defence and foreign policy speech. And it follows some significant developments like AUKUS and the Defence Strategic Review announced in April. And I think this was his attempt to sell Australia to the region, if you like, in terms that were robust, but also calculated not to offend. He did make a major pitch around the theme of guardrails, which is language that the United States has used to try and, in effect, put a kind of barrier between itself and China, which doesn't prevent competition, but rather regulates it. So he was reinforcing that. And I think implicitly telling the Chinese it would be good to embrace at least that sort of minimum level of dialogue. It was very much around dialogue. He couched his references to defence with sort of diplomatic language. So he juxtaposed capability and relationships and deterrence and diplomacy. So it was, in a way, trying to say that Australia is there and doing something useful and brings heft, but he was definitely pitching it at such a level that it was designed to appeal to an audience in Southeast Asia and beyond.